Hello, and welcome to the podcast, Invisible Wound. This podcast is a limited series of 6 episodes, which is part of a larger project called Hakara, Facing Transgenerational Trauma. This project was initiated by AMCHA. AMCHA is an organization that was established in 1987 by a group of Holocaust survivors and devoted mental health professionals. My name is Sharon Ryba-Kahn. I'm a Berlin-based filmmaker and a third generation of survivors of the Shoah. This is the perspective I'll be speaking from. For this podcast, we will be traveling to what is known to be the world's oldest continent, and which we know as Australia. The Aboriginal people of Australia are the custodians of the world's oldest living culture, a culture that is 60,000 years old. In order for me to avoid any types of cultural appropriation, I ask each of my guests to introduce themselves and for them to share where they are from and how they perceive trauma, and also how fighting trauma is present in their work and in their lives. We have dedicated the last 2 episodes to Larissa Behrendt. Welcome, Larissa. Would you like to introduce yourself?
I'm Larissa Behrendt. I'm a First Nations Australian woman from the Yuwalarai and Gamilaroi Nations, and I'm an academic, a writer, a broadcaster, a novelist, and a filmmaker.
You have indeed so many merits, and I'm so happy that you actually chose the works you wanted to discuss in this podcast, which is, on the one hand, your film After the Apology, a documentary film that came out in 2017, and your novel After Story, which was published in summer 2021. So why did you choose them?
For me, the issue of the removal of Aboriginal children from their families has been almost a life's work in terms of trying to work to repair the impact of that policy. It was a policy that affected my own family, with my grandmother being removed as part of that policy and my father also being brought up in an institution. And in a way, I sort of understood intergenerational trauma before I knew the word for it, because I'd seen how that policy had impacted through 3 generations of my family. After the Apology is a film that looks at the issue in a contemporary way, the increasing rates of Indigenous child removal in Australia today. So it felt like that was an important part of the conversation from my perspective, was through this policy, and that's what the film's about. And in a very different way, After Story is a novel that looks at intergenerational trauma on victims of crime. So it looks at the impact of a murder in a family 20 years after the murder's taken place on the mother-daughter relationship of the child slash sister of the girl who was murdered. And that's through my other legal work. I've seen how the failure to get a sense of closure or to find justice in these kind of cases where there has been a murder continues to echo down the generations, that the grief of the parents becomes the grief of the children. And I felt that was a phenomenon I was seeing that people weren't really talking about when they looked at the impact of crime on families. So for me, these 2 projects of mine, I feel like look at trauma and intergenerational trauma in very different ways, but in ways that complement as well.
So you're both an artist and an academic, right? And is there one of them you identify with more? And these 2 ways of expressing yourself, are they both ways in which you try to fight against the injustice in society?
Yeah, I find it hard to compartmentalise, really. I find if it feels like there are disparate ways that I practice what I do, whether it's as a lawyer or as a writer or as a filmmaker, the subject matter is very similar. It's all about injustice in my community, or it's about the celebration of the resilience and strength of my community. So sometimes I do look at the disadvantage and the trauma, but there's a lot of times I like to look at it from a strengths-based approach. For me, it's almost like the project's the same, the methods in which I try and explore how to challenge the system change over time. And I guess there's been an evolution of my own work. You become a lawyer because you advocate for other people, you speak for them in a system where the language and the process and the rules are foreign to your client. And I guess over time I've realised that filmmaking actually allows me to provide a space for those same people I work with in my legal practice to tell their stories in their own way. And that in itself can be a very powerful way of getting change. However compelling our legal arguments are, or our critique of policy is, hearing from a person, from their own personal experience in how an injustice by the system has impacted on their life is incredibly powerful. So I guess it's been a part of my own process of an advocate to think more complexly about what it takes to actually create a real systemic change.
Have you seen change happen thanks to showing your films?
I have. I certainly have seen that in relation to how that storytelling will affect decision makers within government departments or politicians who are making laws. I've seen some very concrete ways in which those personal stories have been able to connect in a way that parliamentary submissions or legal arguments haven't. So I think that's certainly been a place where I've seen that impact. What I've also seen too, which I think is also important, there's a lot of shame for people who find themselves in a position where the state has taken their children wrongly. And one of the challenges in fighting back against the state in those situations is how powerless the parents or grandparents feel. So what I've seen through being able to tell stories through the medium of film is it's actually allowed other people who have suffered the same injustice to know that they're not alone and to actually feel like there are things they can do. So that's been a great learning of mine. I assumed it would have impact on policymakers and lawmakers. I underestimated how important it would be for other people who were feeling trauma or had been victims of injustice. So that's been a very important thing for me to learn.
Wow. Is there maybe a story you could share then with some concrete examples?
So when I was doing my first feature film was a film I made with the families of 3 children who were murdered in a town in Barraville. These were 3 Aboriginal families, and the police investigation was poorly done. It wasn't treated seriously as a crime when it first happened. The children all disappeared within a 6-month period, and the police treated it as though the children had run away, even though one was only 3 years old. They had implied that it was perhaps a case of parental abuse, that it was an issue for about child welfare rather than a homicide. So the failures of that original police investigation meant that the person who had been the prime suspect in the murders was never able to be brought to justice. And there was a strong push by the families to have the case reopened and some legal changes made that would allow that to happen. And we made the film just as a parliamentary inquiry was being set up into the murders, and we were able to play the documentary to the parliamentarians when they first started their inquiry into the injustice of this case and what had gone wrong and what had gone wrong with the police investigation and what changes needed to happen more broadly. And it struck me when the report of this investigation was handed down in Parliament, every parliamentarian supported the changes. There'd been mixed views about it, but everyone came on board. And at that period when they were talking to the report, that parliamentary session, almost everyone started with the phrase, as a parent, as a father, as a mother. And I thought what we'd seen was the way that the families, by talking about the fact that this was really about getting justice for their children, really connected in a personal way with parliamentarians who were being told that this was a legal issue. And I think they got to see that it was so much more than that, and it really motivated them. So that was a very powerful way in which I saw that.
Wow, that is amazing. I can't actually imagine something like that happening in Germany, to be honest. I think that it's absolutely wonderful that you have the opportunity to screen the films to parliamentarians, and that documentary can be such an enabler for change. That's absolutely wonderful. Would you say then that as a consequence, these people acted maybe less detached, felt more connected, acted more from their heart?
I think that's right. It is really about the hearts and minds part of the story. And it's very easy when things are described in statistics. The impact of child removal is one of those things. You know, we talk about the percentage of children taken or the percentage of children in out-of-home care. And that is a way of disassociating from the human impact, but you can hear just one story of how a child being wrongfully removed from a family impacts that child and the family itself, what it means to a parent to not be able to provide for their child, to have their child taken from them, to be judged incorrectly as a bad parent. And I find working in this space incredibly difficult. There's almost an assumption that if you say to somebody that you have a case where a child has been removed, that they almost instinctively think, well, there must be a reason. There's still a lot of faith that the system somehow works, or that there's no, that mistakes would not be made about something so important. As a legal practitioner, I found consistently there were cases where people were judged incorrectly. People would make the most appalling decisions. They would see a child who was underweight and assume the child was neglected because the parents were Aboriginal. And it would take us 8 months to get the case to court, to show all the medical documentation to show that the child had a medical condition that was being properly treated, which explained the underweight. But that's 8 months that a child is in out-of-home care before a court says this child should be returned to the family, this child should never have been taken. That's 8 months of a child in an institutional situation that will ruin them for life. They will never get over that experience of having been taken from their family for that 8 months because the system's made a mistake. And the only way to get people to know this is an issue is to hear that story and to conclude at the end of hearing that story that the system's made a terrible mistake. Just saying the statistics doesn't make people think that there's something wrong.
You know, being in Berlin, meaning being so far away, it seems really unbelievable to me that these same mistakes would continue to happen. How do you explain that?
I see the same kinds of assumptions that were made at the time when Aboriginal children were removed as a government policy designed to assimilate Aboriginal children being made today. There is a cultural conflict there. So, for example, in our community, we have a lot of broader family bringing up children. So when I was growing up, it wouldn't be unusual for me to spend a night at an auntie's place and then a night at another auntie's place and then a night at home with my family. everyone knew where I was. Communal parenting is a really big part of Aboriginal upbringing, and we still see that today. But when a childcare worker sees that, they see that the child's neglected because it's not staying in the same place every night. So they will remove the child on the basis of it being neglected because of that. So they see those kind of decisions being made. And the other time that becomes a really big issue is particularly middle-class people who've come into the child protection system as workers often equate poverty with neglect. So if you've grown up in a poor household, you know that just because you don't have a lot doesn't mean you're not loved or that you're neglected, but they will make a judgment based on the fact that they don't think there's enough food in the house or enough money in the bank and say this child is neglected because the parents are poor. These are value judgments that actually can lead to really devastating results for families. And it shows a lack of understanding about how people with very few resources still care for their children and provide for them. They do it in lots of different ways. And that is a set system of judgment calls made based on middle-class white experience of what would constitute neglect. There's judgments made without understanding the cultural and socioeconomic position of the people that they're judging.
So these cultural assumptions that you're speaking about, they must be extremely re-traumatizing.
Absolutely. And it is something that has gone down for generations. The whole assumption made when there was a formal policy of removing Aboriginal children from their families as part of assimilating them was a racist assumption that those children would be better off if they grew up as white children than they would be if they stayed with their Aboriginal families. And we still see that kind of thinking today in the kind of cases that we do. And there's often, as soon as there's any sense that a child might be in trouble, they're underweight. I had another case where a girl was crying at school all the time. So the immediate assumption was somehow she was being neglected. She was removed from the school, sent to the other side of Australia for a range of reasons before her family even knew she'd been removed from the school. It took 9 months to get this young girl back to her family. And the reason she was crying was because she was being bullied at school. But the quick assumption was made that it was coming from her home. Her grandmother, who was bringing her up, was able to show the child never missed school. She always had her lunch. She was cared for. But they see an Aboriginal child and they make a judgment that if that child is in distress, before asking a single question, that somehow it's the fault of the family. And that I see in the decision-making all the time. And it takes 8 to 9 months to get a case before court for a first hearing. So that is 8 to 9 months before those cases can be rectified. And these are cases where on the first hearing, the judge says this child should never have been removed, send this child back to their family, but all that trauma has happened to that family and that child that can't be undone because of that mistake. So I do see something that's incredibly cyclical. It's the same reasoning that removes the child now that would have removed a child in that family a generation or 2 generations before.
So why do you think, I mean, you're a lawyer, you're a filmmaker. I mean, you are dealing with society at large all the time. I mean, is there a change happening? And if so, where is that change visible?
I think there is a change happening in one way. And this is where it's really important to focus on the strength of the Aboriginal community. And what I do in my film after the apology is I look at a number of cases from around the country that highlight the issues that you and I have just been talking about, that show specific examples of that happening. But it also looks at what the Aboriginal community is doing in terms of trying to ensure Aboriginal children stay with their families. So we have community organisations that now work in the child protection space. In a way, they're in competition with government departments. But what I show in the film is that where the community, the Aboriginal community, has control or works in the child protection space, they're much more effective at ensuring that Aboriginal children can stay with their family, because they're much more interested in looking at early intervention. So if there is a crisis in the family, so for example, maybe there's domestic violence and a mother wants to leave that relationship, they provide support to ensure that that woman can leave safely and have her children stay with her. I've had clients who've had their children removed when they've left a domestic violence situation because the department has said that the refuge the woman's staying in isn't safe for children. So the children have been removed, and it's a terrible situation. But community intervention can support a person in that situation. So the early intervention when families are in crisis to prevent removal, and they're much better able at being able to say, well, if mum's got, say, some postnatal depression and just needs relief, we can find someone in the community, in the extended family, that can care for that child. Departments take no interest in finding someone in the extended family to find a child. One of the things looked at in the film is that the department had said, you know, we've placed these Aboriginal children in white families because we couldn't find Aboriginal carers. And an Aboriginal community organisation's gone in and just through Facebook found extended family in about 2 minutes that those children could have been placed with. So you've got that element. And the final thing is, when government departments move children from their families, they're not interested in putting them back with families. There are people who make huge incomes from looking after children who are in out-of-home care, and it's a business. And their financial interest is in conflict with getting those children back to their families. Our community-controlled organisations work directly to ensure that reunification and restitution happens if a child has to be removed. So there's a lot of work done by the community that is seeking to counter the impact of the department.
So just to clarify, you're saying it's a business. Could you explain why the government would rather support that business?
People who benefit from having a business where they get paid to have children in out-of-home care are against the government making any reforms that gives power back to the community. And it's not as simple as saying to the government, you'll save money if you do the early intervention. They know that. They choose not to do it. They put more money into the removal and to have a child in out-of-home care for the 8 months that it might be between when they're removed and when they're told that they should never have been removed and they go back will have cost the government hundreds of thousands of dollars. Sometimes they have nowhere to put those children and they're just kept in hotel rooms. The system is appalling, but it's no different to the criminal justice system. The cost of locking somebody up in prison is exorbitant. It's a lot more than if you invested in early intervention programs or alternative pathways to keep people out of prison. But governments who are tough on crime don't care about that math. They still make private prisons that keep people who are in that business flush with funds because they'd rather spend it in that way than to do the investment to keep people on those other pathways. The child protection system is the same. And in fact, they are the two places, overrepresentation in the criminal justice system and overrepresentation in the out-of-home care system, so children in out-of-home care, are two ways in which the colonial state, the Australian state, continues to traumatize Aboriginal people. They're locked up or they're removed from their families, and those two traumas become cyclical.
That's a really great moment to actually start speaking a little bit about your novel, because what's so amazing about an after story to me is that you write so beautifully about, the two main characters go on this trip to England and get to know the literary colonial canon, right? This is such an interesting setting. Why did you pick that, and what is it that you wanted to show with that?
There were a couple of things about that I liked. There's been a kind of there's a large number of books written by white people coming to study Aboriginal people, and I like the idea of flipping that on its head. And particularly through my character of Della, the mum, having a very cheeky but insightful way of looking at this other curious culture and analysing it in a similar way. So that was a large part of that choice. But the other thing about it for me too is I spent quite a bit of time overseas when I was studying, and I worked in Canada for a year after completing my studies at Harvard. And then, before the pandemic, I loved traveling. And I think whether you spend a long time overseas or a small time, whatever you learn about the place you go, you always learn something about yourself. I'm really fascinated by how putting yourself in other environments and exposing yourself to other ideas and other cultures can tell you more about yourself or help you see yourself differently. And I guess for me, that was the other thing about it too. It was being able to put my characters in a space where I know one becomes very self-reflective and learns things about yourself. And I guess the final thing for me was I did do some of those types of tours with my mother when I was much younger, where you get on the bus and off the bus and on the bus and off the bus. And just as a narrative device, it's a good way to keep your characters really close together so that, if they are having a fight or they're annoyed with each other, they really can't escape. So there were a range of reasons that felt like that was the right place to explore it. And, obviously one of the big themes of the book is the storytelling tradition of my own First Nations culture and the literary tradition, the Western canon that I grew up with and really loved. And it felt like it was an interesting twist to explore that in the UK context rather than exploring it in the Australian one.
One of the things that I find so incredibly brave about your work and so daring is that, and actually they have that in common, both in After Story as in After the Apology, actually, so in your novel and in your film, is you actually dare to show the vulnerable sides of your characters. You're not afraid to show that an Aboriginal woman may have a drinking problem. You are actually confronting it and dealing with this. And I know, for instance, that as a Jewish woman living in Germany, I'm always really concerned and worried with how what I say will impact the non-Jewish German populations. I'll be worried that I could trigger an anti-Semitic reaction. Does that make sense, what I'm asking?
Yes. And particularly with that, I mean, I think the important thing is the motivation to write from a place of love and understanding. And then I think it makes it easier to look at people's flaws and understand them as hurts in a way. And the drinking, for me, the complex relationship with alcohol is part of trauma. People drink because they're traumatized. And I think I have a character that very much does that. And in fact, I seeded the mother character clearly having the relationship with alcohol that was very problematic. But I also wrote the daughter as being unreflective about the fact that she actually also drinks a lot. It's not something she even acknowledges in the book, but if you read it, you can see she drinks as much as her mother does sometimes. And it's that sense of that. And look, I find that the issue about alcohol a really interesting one, because Australian culture, white Australians drink all the time. So the idea that it's somehow just Aboriginal people who have that issue with alcohol is amusing to me. In the legal profession, when I first started working there, people would, Friday, you'd start drinking at lunch and that would be the end of it. And that would be the end of the working day. It would just be drinking after that. You know, middle-class dinner parties and drinks at art galleries. Alcohol is awash there, and yet there is this criticism of Aboriginal people. I remember being at a legal convention and this magistrate came up to me, a very high-ranked chief magistrate of one of our territories, and he was absolutely drunk and said to me in a very slurred voice, "The problem with the Aborigines is the alcohol." I mean, it's just find that bizarre. You know, there's no sense of irony in saying that whatsoever. And I grew up with a father, as I mentioned, who had been institutionalised, and alcohol was a very big crutch for him. So I felt like there was an honesty about saying this is what happens to, you know, the members of our family who have had to carry this trauma with very little support in terms of how they unpack it. And similarly, like the character of Della, my father wasn't a violent person, he wasn't an abusive person, but he had a trauma and a hurt that he didn't know how to express or deal with or even to verbalise, and that was the way he coped with it. So if it's brave, it's only because it felt honest and authentic. And I wrote her character with love because I loved my dad, you know, even though that was a part of who he was too.
Just to ask again, and all the love comes across so beautifully, I mean, incredibly. And I absolutely adore Della, I have to say. I love her. I think she may be my favorite character in the book. But were you concerned about how white Australians will read them and understand them? Was there at any point a concern? Do you know what I mean when I say that?
Yeah,
a worry?
I felt like if I could make the characters rich enough and have so much of them on the page, that was just one element of them, that they weren't a caricature, they weren't a stereotype, but there was a richness that was unexpected in those characters that would take a reader to a deeper understanding of the issues that we were talking about, rather than getting blindsided or being dismissive because of one aspect of that character. To me, the strongest thing for Della is her voice and the way she sees the world. And it's been one of the strongest reactions that both non-Indigenous and Indigenous people have had to the book, is that they love the character of Della the most. And her voice came very quickly to me because she was based on a very, very dear friend of mine who sadly has just recently passed, who had no issue with alcohol, and the story was not her story. The idea for Della's story came from an amalgam of other ideas, but the voice and how she sees the world and how she speaks, her intonation, her cadence, were all based on my friend. So I felt like that finding that voice and having her voice so strong would draw a reader to her ideas and her perception and her observations and her deeper story without being distracted by the result of the trauma. That's actually the impact of the murder of her child and then subsequently the revealing of deeper trauma in her life that draws the reader in. And you do get to then, I hope, understand that what she relies on to get through that trauma is a consequence of it. And you see it in that context. And I think for me that was important.
I definitely think you see it. But I think that would be a great moment to maybe have you read a bit of it. What do you say?
Okay. All I can remember, and this is what I told the police over and over again, is that there was a party at the house and I'd been drinking. I went to bed at midnight, 1 o'clock. The girls were in the bedroom with me. That's how it was back then, all of us in one bed. Brittany was 7, Leanne 5, and Jazzy only 3. I slept right through to morning. I was never much good at knowing what time it was or describing in measurements how far something was from something else. What I do know is that when I did finally wake up, sunlight was streaming through the holes in the sheet that covered the window, making rays of light in the floating dust. You'd have thought something so pretty was a good sign, but luck was never much on my side. I laid there for a while watching dust fairies dancing in the air. I felt groggy, like the alcohol I'd drunk the night before had affected me much more than it should have. I wasn't surprised that the girls were already up. They always did their own thing, and there were plenty of people around to keep an eye on them. It's hard to imagine that now, but back then you just never worried. When I walked out of the bedroom, Jazzy was in front of the television playing with her cousin, plump little Kylie. My head was thick as stew, so I made a cup of tea and took it out to the porch, more than ready for my first smoke of the day. We had some plastic chairs there so you could sit and watch the street, right down to the end where the town turned back to bush. From here I could see who was coming and going, see who was visiting who. It was the type of place where the neighbours would stop as they walked by to have a quick chat over the low rusty mesh fence. The houses only ran down one side of the road. On the other side was bushland hiding a nearby creek. We called the part of the town we lived in Frog Hollow because it flooded first, although it was never called that on any map. The kids in our street didn't have much but never seemed bored because they made their own fun. I could see Leanne riding a small pink bicycle that belonged to next door's girl. Up and down their driveway she was pedalling full of purpose. On one side the bike had streamers on the handlebars, on the other they'd been ripped out. It's funny the things you remember and the things you forget. As I rested my head, tired and heavy from the night before, I scanned the street. "You seen Brittany?" I yelled out to Leanne so she'd know I was there watching. She shook her head and kept concentrating on working the pink petals with her little feet. I wasn't concerned at first. Brittany's father, Jimmy, was living 2 doors down, and she could have just as easily been there or in any of the houses along our street. So I can't tell you why, but as I sat in the slow-warming autumn morning, I started to feel uneasy, like there was a fishing line in my stomach, looking for something to hook. I walked over to Jimmy's house and found him nursing his own savage hangover. Brittany wasn't there, so I went to Auntie Elaine's house, the last in our street. She rang my sister Kiki, who lived 2 blocks over, close to a row of small family-run shops on the main road. By the time Kiki arrived, I was going from house to house, knocking on doors. That deep, crawling feeling kept growing, spreading out like dark honey spilt over a tablecloth. Together, Kiki and I tried every friend of Brittany's we could think of. No one had seen her. No one knew where she was. We searched down at the creek and in the surrounding bush, our voices echoing in the silence, and all the while, the darkness inside me kept growing. By late afternoon, Kiki took me to the police station and we reported Brittany missing. Even then, I was hoping against the howling blood in my veins she'd walk through the door, oblivious to all the panic she'd caused. But that's not what happened, and life was never the same again.
Thank you for that. So beautiful. Makes me want to read the book all over again. Now that I just finished it and I was like, oh yeah, now I could read it again. Dear listeners, this episode ends here, but the talk with Larissa continues in our next and final episode. Thank you for listening to our podcast, Invisible Wound.